Hello, listeners. My name is Faolan Smith, and today I'm joined by my co-host.
Hey, I'm Dr. Chris Kaatz at Stephen F. Austin State University.
So today we're going to be analyzing one of the core pieces of wind band repertoire, Vaughan Williams' English Folk Song Suite, or Folk Song Suite, as people call it both. We're also going to be analyzing another movement from the suite called Sea Songs. So before we really get into analyzing this, let's talk about Vaughan Williams himself, because he's a really popular composer who composed a lot of influential pieces that were important. So a little background about him. He was born in Gloucester, England in 1872. So it's a region in western England. His parents were not musically inclined. Primarily, his family were lawyers, and his family was not musically inclined in the immediate family, as I mentioned previously. Later on in his childhood, he got piano lessons from an aunt, and then he also received lessons from violin and organ later in his life. During his teenage years, he attended the Charterhouse Prep School, where he received viola lessons. He switched his instruments there. And then after that, he attended the Royal College of Music for 2 years. While he was there, he met another really well-known British composer, Gustav Holst, and the two became lifelong friends. After 2 years there, he transferred to Trinity College in Cambridge. He finished off his degrees there, and he graduated with 2 degrees, one a Bachelor's of Music and also of History. With his professional life, he didn't really have a whole lot to do because he was composing. A lot of his pieces weren't really as well known. So he primarily worked as a choral master. He also worked as a church organist. And a lot of his compositions, except for a few of them in the early part of his life, did not really become popular. His most famous early in his life was a piece for string orchestra called Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis, which is for double string orchestra and string quartet. And it was written in 1909, and it was revised 1913, 1919. 1919 editions, the most commonly played version now. Eventually, he was drafted to serve in World War I, so he went and served. And when he got back, he said the war really changed how he felt about his life, and he decided to go into teaching. He got accepted to the Royal College of Music as a professor. He started conducting the choruses there, and he also met a prominent conductor named Adrian Bolt, and Adrian was considered some of the foremost interpreter of his music. He was writing a lot of choral pieces at the time, and his orchestral works were still kind of unknown. He did write a symphony a few years prior, and it was still gaining popularity there. He also was a professor of composition at the Royal College of Music, and one really notable student of his was Gordon Jacob. So those who don't know, especially in the wind band repertoire world, Gordon Jacob is a known wind band composer. He wrote multiple new pieces, and one of his most known is a piece called Old Wine in New Bottles, because it's based on old English folk music. And I know the SFA Wind Ensemble played that last semester.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a pretty standard repertoire chamber ensemble or wind chamber piece, and Gordon Jacob has contributed, like you said. It was really good to highlight that he's contributed several notable works to the wind repertoire.
And in 1934, he finally had some successful compositions come out. There were other ones previously, but in terms like symphonic repertoire, he wrote his 4th symphony, which is a symphony that no one really knows a lot about. Because Vaughan Williams was asked why he wrote it, and he didn't really say anything. All he described it as a version of pure music, but there's really no way of knowing. One thing that's speculated with it is it was written in response to the death of his friend Gustav Holst in 1934, because the opening part of the symphony, it's extremely dissonant, and the finale of the symphony especially is an angry fugue, and it's believed Vaughan Williams may have wrote this to channel his grief. And after he wrote the symphony, he received multiple awards from it. During the final part of his years, his later compositions received a lot of recognition, especially his symphonies. He started writing in serialism, which is a version of atonality. It was written in the early 1900s. And he passed away of natural causes in 1958. And after that, his music was still pretty well known and still widely performed. In 1994, the Vaughan Williams Society was founded, which basically allows for the preservation and performance of his music.
Yeah, so I think some really important things, especially for wind band conductors that are approaching Vaughan Williams' works. Vaughan Williams was primarily known as an orchestral and a choral composer, but some things that you touched on that are really important to know is Gustav Holst, who is another notable wind band composer that we talked about on a previous podcast. He and Vaughan Williams were friends, and Rafe performed music at Gustav's funeral. And the two of them were involved in this folk music revival that was going on in England at the time in the early and mid 20th century. And that's an important thing for a lot of his output, is that it, even in the pieces where he doesn't explicitly use folk songs as the generative material, a lot of his music sounds folk song-esque. So he collaborated with Cecil Sharp, who was a very well-known, at least in England, collector of folk songs, and created some resources that had kind of compendiums of English folk songs in the 20th century. And Vaughan Williams and Holst and other composers would use these resources and sometimes just take the folk songs verbatim to be the primary melodic material of works that they would create. And Vaughan Williams was one of, some people would even say, the prominent English composer of the 20th century, and that carries with it a certain expectation when we listen to his music. So just like with the French, we will sometimes think about, Impressionism, so Debussy, a lot of, really colorful harmony, maybe some of that harmony being non-functional, meaning that there's not a particular chord progression, it's just the colors are really, really pretty, but it's sort of vague in terms of what is happening to emulate the impressionistic visual art style. And if we think about German music, we usually think of things that are, really bombastic and loud and aggressive, and there's probably a lot of intricacy when you're looking at the form. There's certain cultural implications of pieces depending on where the composer comes from. Part of why it's really important for us to know about a composer when we're studying a piece. So with 20th century English composers, some of the things that are fairly common with them is there's going to be some lush lyricism. Ralph Vaughan Williams' theme, Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis, is a great example of that. A really lush, beautiful, kind of melancholic lyrical lines in that piece. A really beautiful piece, one of his better-known compositions. Most English composers of the 20th century would be fairly tonal as well, and they would use folk songs or evoke folk songs, like we talked about with the folk song revival of their native music being really popular in the 20th century. And some, like Ralph Vaughan Williams, experimented with serialism the later we got into the 20th century, as that started to become really in vogue with the Second Viennese School led by Arnold Schoenberg, but that's a podcast for another time. And I know Ralph Vaughan Williams in his Ninth Symphony experimented a little bit with serialism.
He also incorporated lots of jazz styles in that symphony as well. He brought an alto saxophone into it. It was a great symphony, and serialism is no doubt one of the biggest things a lot of composers experimented with in the 1900s.
Yeah, the mid-1900s, there was a lot of experimentation with different styles of composition, which, maybe in a future podcast we can talk about that. That would be fun. But borrowing of jazz elements by European composers, that became pretty popular in the mid to late 20th century also. I know Darius Milhaud has a piece, La Création du Monde. The famous French composer, he borrowed some jazz ideas from his visits to the States, and so that kind of became popularized in Europe as well. So with Vaughan Williams, his output was pretty broad, as we had kind of mentioned earlier. He wrote a lot of works for orchestra and choir. Probably two of his most notable orchestral works are Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis, and then his Norfolk Rhapsody No. 1.
Norfolk Rhapsody is based on multiple folk songs from England. It was written in 1911, so the folk song revival was pretty popular with that piece. There is a second one he wrote, but there's sketches of it. It's been lost for some time. They have a model as to what it could have been like, but there's no definitive proof because the sketches have been lost to time to it.
Mm-hmm. And he wrote 9 symphonies. So for listeners kind of new to the classical music world, there's sort of this thing called the curse of the ninth, where a lot of great master composers would write. I mean, once we get out of the classical period, because Mozart and Haydn were turning out symphonies like they were going out of style, and they have tons and tons of them. But once you get these grander symphonies like the Beethoven symphonies, there's this thing that tends to happen, which is sort of strange, that once a composer writes their Ninth Symphony, they usually pass away before they can write a 10th. So, interestingly enough, William Bolcom, a composer, modern composer who wrote a symphony for band, he wanted to say First Symphony for band instead of having it be a Ninth Symphony or getting him closer to that number because of the curse of the ninth. So it's kind of interesting how some composers will do that.
The only composer who is believed to have beat the curse was Shostakovich, because he wrote 15 symphonies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, although he did not have a super cheery life, so he probably, growing up in Soviet Russia, he had a rough go of things. So at least he was able to get that little feather in his cap before he left us. Of the 9 symphonies that Vaughan Williams wrote, like Faolan, you were saying earlier, the Fourth Symphony is probably his most well-known symphony.
Yeah, C Symphony is also pretty known too. That's his first symphony. But all of his symphonies are amazing. And believe it or not, the Fourth Symphony is one of, I believe, 3 symphonies that don't have another name associated with it. So like his first symphony is called the C Symphony, his third symphony is called the Pastoral. So it's pretty interesting he chose not to name the Fourth Symphony.
Interesting, yeah. He also has 2 pretty notable concerti. There's this piece called The Lark Ascending, which is originally written for violin. So it's a soloist piece featuring the violin, like a violin virtuoso, pretty permanently with orchestra. There's also a really good transcription of that for flute and wind band. That's a great piece. And then he also has a tuba concerto, which tends to be pretty popular. There's not a ton of really reputable tuba concerti by past deceased mainstream big notable composers, so I know that gets a decent amount of play in the tuba world. He also wrote film scores. He has 10 of those to his credit. He has 5 ballets to his credit, and then he has written 5 works for the wind band that were originally written for the wind band. There's tons of transcriptions of his other pieces for winds, but of his entire output, only 5 of them were originally conceived for band. So we have the English Folk Song Suite and Sea Songs, which we're going to talk about today. Both of those were penned and completed in 1923. He has Flourish for wind band, which is a good piece for anybody working with a younger, more developing ensemble. It's a short little good kind of introductory to a concert sort of piece. He has this piece called Toccata Martiale, which was written around the same time as the English Folk Song Suite and Sea Songs, and that's another kind of good concert opener. It's sort of like Flourish for wind band, but more advanced. And then he has a piece from his 8th Symphony, one of the movements called Scherzo alla Marcia. That piece, you can excerpt it because it's only written for winds. So in that symphony, that particular movement only uses the wind section and does not use the strings. So we can kind of loosely call that a piece for band, even though it's for orchestral winds. So there's no saxophones or euphoniums in that. It's just kind of your standard orchestral wind section.
Yeah, so now let's get into what we're going to analyze, the English Folk Song Suite. So let's learn more about the suite itself. Like, what do we know about it? Yeah,
so it's, I think, Vaughan Williams referred to this as just the Folk Song Suite. And the title English was slapped onto it later by a publisher to make it, I guess, a little bit more marketable. I'm not entirely sure why. But we're also going to talk about Sea Songs, because Sea Songs was originally conceived as a 4th movement of this piece. It's technically the 2nd movement, so it wouldn't be the one that would end the suite. But the English Folk Song Suite has 3 movements, with Sea Songs originally being a 4th movement, but Rafe decided to excerpt that and turn it into a separately published work later on in his life.
The piece was originally written for a military band, so what is a military band?
Yeah, so a military band is a tradition that extends back several hundred years, and they were originally sort of a functional entity of a military unit. They were used to help organize troop movements and that sort of thing. Eventually, they grew out to be more of a customary group of musicians associated with the military that would work to sort of increase morale and put on civic functions. And we have, in the United States, every branch of our military has numerous military bands, with each branch having a premier band that's based in D.C. And it was the military bands back in Vaughan Williams' time were somewhat akin to this sort of group. So you had people that were associated with the military that would be part of the military, and part of their function would be to play instruments. And the instrumentation, so the instruments instruments that were used in the folk song suite are that set of instruments is very similar to the modern day sort of concert band instrumentation.
One notable example was the euphonium was called a baritone horn back then, so it looked a lot different.
Yeah,
it sounded really similar to it.
Yeah, I know you being a euphonium player, you're all about drawing connections to the past of your instrument, which is great.
Yeah, it's only around a couple hundred years. It's a great instrument to talk about.
Yeah, as a saxophonist, I feel the same way because you and I play two of the younger instruments in the sort of concert canon of Western music.
It's great.
Yeah.
And Holst also had a lot of influence on the Vaughan Williams as well. Like, they're both part of the English folk song revival, which began in, I believe, 1907, which is when composers were starting to, like, incorporate folk songs and put them in their music. This is also popular with Cecil Sharp, as I mentioned. Mm-hmm. And one really notable connection to the suite to the whole suites from the English folk song suite is the style of the marches they're written in. Because if you listen to the second suite and do a form analysis of it, the marches in the suite are written in a very similar form. And even with the time signatures, they're written very similarly. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and while I don't have evidence to back this up, I would not be at all surprised. I'm sure maybe some listener out there does, and if you do, reach out because I'd love to learn about this. I would not be at all surprised if Vaughan Williams went and talked to Holst about Holst's or folk song suites, if you will. So Holst has two suites for military band, the suite in E flat being all originally composed music, but it's evocative of folk song music, and then Holst's second suite in F was written a few years after that in 1911, if I'm getting my dates right. 1909 was when he wrote his first suite. The second suite, all of the main melodic material is English folk songs. And Vaughan Williams did not finish his folk song suite until the early 1920s, so it's very likely that he heard performances of the whole suites, talked with Gustav himself about the music, and took some of the ideas from the whole suites, especially the second suite, and incorporated them into his own English folk song suite.
And we will be analyzing the second suite in a future episode, so keep an eye out for that.
Yeah.
And also Cecil Sharp, I know we mentioned him previously. He was a really notable English folk song corrector. There was someone in America who was doing that named Ruth Crawford Seeger. She worked with the United States government. She went around recording and transcribing folk songs. That's kind of like what Sharp was doing. The only thing was he wasn't recording them because recording material in that time was still very young. So he went and actually wrote it and transcribed it down for piano or just for vocals. He found ways to write it and keep it in society at the time.
Yeah. So one thing before we start jumping into the analysis of each of the movements, if you're using the 2008 edition, which is a mostly cleaned up critical edition of the piece, there is still a fairly extensive errata list for that work. I think we're going to try to drop that in the comments of the podcast on YouTube. So if you're looking for that, you can contact us and we can get that to you, or it should be on the comments. So let's jump in.
All right. So the suite is in three movements. We're going to start with movement 1, the March, parenthesis 17 come Sunday. So let's first see what a march is, because a march has a pretty interesting history with it, especially the concert band march. Mm-hmm. So the quote unquote march style originated in Turkey. It was originally written, you can see, for piano and like other small ensembles. And Beethoven wrote a really famous Turkish march. Mozart wrote the really famous one. That's what they envisioned marches were back then. They weren't like these fanfaric pieces. And in the symphonic repertoire, one of the most notable marches was Berlioz's Symphony Fantastique. Shout out to my friends in SFASO. The fourth movement is a march. It was written in the Turkish style of a march. And that's why it doesn't sound like how the concert marches we know now. And also some of the percussion instruments were used in that movement were from Turkey. So Berlioz is really influenced by the Turkish style of writing marches. That's why Symphony Fantastique sounds way different with marches. And in 1860s, it was the middle part of the 1860s, the United States was dealing with a civil war. And it was pretty hairy with the Confederacy and the Union. And the U.S. military bands were still pretty popular. And one of the band leaders named Claudio Graffola, he was from Spain, and he knew a lot about European marches, European music. He decided to write a very new type of march. This march was called Washington Grays. It's very popular. And Washington Gray's eventually became the march style we know today. A lot of people think Sousa started that march style. No, he took that from Grafala, because Sousa was also a military band leader, and he based it a lot off Grafala's marches. And Washington Gray's started with the opening first strain, then the second strain, then the lyrical trio, then eventually he ended with the dogfight strain, and then it really incorporated that. It also, marches also were played a lot during parades, so it was pretty interesting able to he added in the famous march syncopation, especially like the French horns. They have to have syncopated sections with the march, and he added that in too. After that, a lot of the marches we know and love started arising from that, especially with tempos. A lot of people don't really know the difference between European and American marches. European marches typically are more statelier. Sometimes they're played at a slower tempo compared to American marches. The typical American march tempo roughly is 120. Especially with Sousa, he was strict on his marches being played at 120. But you fast forward to like Carl L. King, he was like posing circus marches. He was saying 144 or 132, ridiculously fast tempos. And also in Europe, one of those notable marches was a march called the Florentiner by Julius Fusick. Fusick wrote the tempo for that to be about 112, so slightly slower than the typical American march form. And also, it's more stately. It's not like just a fanfare. It's more packed, it's more stately and more light. And also, marches can get kind of slow, because especially with Zoe Elliott's British Eighths March, he requested the tempo for that be at 92 beats per minute, which is very slow for that kind of march. But the march is very processional and it's very stately. And a lot of the marches we know and love, they came from this. Like, especially if you listen to Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance, March number 1, you kind of can hear the processional, like, slow tempo with that in the trio.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's you can go down a very long, deep rabbit hole researching marches. But so that's some good background on that. And I think good things to note are that definitely British marches, as Americans, if you're an American listener, we think Sousa. And we think that kind of march, and that's not necessarily how British marches are laid out. And a lot of times when I'm working with students in the States that are analyzing this piece, the English Folk Song Suite, they're a little bit thrown for a loop because they're like, well, it's a march, but it should have, all these elements that an American march does, but it's not because it's a British march. So talking about that, a lot of students will sometimes be surprised about the form of the marches in this piece. And the first movement is actually laid out in an arch form. And so that would be, like an A section, B section, C section, and then we go reverse, B section, A section. And with this whole piece, the folk songs are sort of the key to determining the form. And Rafe does not really try to hide the use of the folk songs. I mean, he even writes in the edition, in the 2008 edition, the titles of the marches are given for you when they begin, and they're the primary melodic material, so it's pretty obvious because oftentimes the key will change and when we get to a new section, so it's very obvious that we're in a new section of the piece. So the way that this works is that in the first movement, March 17 Come Sunday, 17 Come Sunday is the first folk song that we hear, and that sort of serves as our A section. And then when we get to measure 31, we get this lovely little tune called Pretty Caroline, and we'll talk a little bit more about each of these folk songs in a moment. And that forms sort of our B section. And then we get to measure 65, and we go into 6/8, and we're in this really aggressive Faolan section. We get this tune called Dives and Lazarus, and that's repeated. And then we get a da capo al fine, meaning da capo is Italian for from the head, meaning head or beginning. So you go back to the beginning, and then you go until this marking that says fine, or finish, or end. And so we go back to after Dives and Lazarus, we get this little section of Pretty Caroline again, which would be another B, and then we get the da capo al coda. So really, you go back to the beginning, finish playing 17 Come Sunday, and then there's a 3-bar coda that you get at the end of that before the piece concludes. So you get sort of this arch where you do the first 2 tunes, you get that middle kind of dense, lively tune, and then you go get a section of the B one again, and then go back to the A.
Yeah, so let's talk about the folk songs themselves. Let's begin with the opening one, 17 Come Sunday. Now, I gave you guys a brief summary of the lyrics. The lyrics are in older English, so I'm going to try to put it for the more present-day audience to understand. So for 17 Kingdom Sunday, the brief summary is that a young soldier who is about 18 or 19, he was drafted in World War I. He meets a girl and he asks her age, and she says, "I will be 17 the coming Sunday." Eventually, the two get to know each other, and their relationship turns more serious, and they go visit each other at night, and eventually they decide, "Oh, I want to get married." But the girl is kind of afraid as to what her mother will think, because the soldier is older, and the girl is 17. But eventually, she tells her mother, and they get married.
Yeah. And so there's kind of this conflict in the lyrics about that, oh, well, you're younger and we can't get married yet, but we really want to get married and we're falling in love. And it's, it's kind of the tension with the parents and all this sort of stuff. And Vaughan Williams represents this musically. Well, I've not read anything that says he explicitly did this, but I'm guessing, based on my study of the score, that he's evoking some of the emotions of the lyrics via the way that he said it musically, which is a technique we call text painting. And so one of a few ways that he does this to represent these conflicting feelings is the tune is in a minor mode, and he has sort of these stylistic oscillations. So within even a matter of a few beats, we can go from being in legato style to sort of a more accented or staccato or marked style, and then we can go back into legato again. And then there's also some subito dynamic changes. So I get to work on this piece every 3 years with the conducting class at SFA, and even in just the first 18 bars, there's several really notable dynamic changes. Like we start forte, and then that diminuendo's down to at measure 5, we go to pianissimo, so there's sort of this whispering dynamic with a handful of people playing at piano. And then at 14, there's this subito change to mezzo forte, dee-dum-dum-dum, da-ya-yum. And if you read the lyrics, it's just sort of these nonsensical little rhythmic syllables that happen there. And then at 16, it drops back to piano again. And then at 18, you get a lot more people joining. The texture gets a lot thicker, and we're at fortissimo. So you have a hand, even in just measures 13 through 18, there's 1, 2, 3 really notable dynamic changes. And that's, if you're going to perform this piece, I think that's something to pay a lot of attention to detail on, because Vaughan Williams provides a lot of detail, but I think those are things that are constantly overlooked when in performances of this piece.
And for those who don't know, when you see a subito in a score, basically it means suddenly. Just all of a sudden, You say subito forte, it's suddenly loud. So let's go into the second folk song, which is the clarinet and cornet solo, the Pretty Caroline. The summary of it is, this is a very short lyric, it's only like one stanza. The summary of it is, a man sees his beloved Caroline. She's sitting in a field full of daisies and the sunlight shining on her, and he describes her. He describes her clothes, describes her hair, and basically describes how she looks, how beautiful she is in the sunlight.
Yeah, and so some of the ways that Vaughan Williams encapsulates the mood of this folk song is it has a very pastoral sort of setting to it. It's very lyrical. The harmonies are kind of warm. We're in A flat major, which is a fairly kind of warm key. I tend to think of keys in colors, and some people tend to do that too. So A flat major for me is more of like a golden color. And another thing that I think is interesting, and this is just my take on this, but the melody initially, when we first hear the theme introduced, is carried by a solo B-flat clarinet and a solo B-flat cornet. And in the past, in the way that composers would sometimes write is, if you talk about sonata theory, you sort of have two themes in a sonata form, and one being stereotypically masculine or, really animated and loud and probably more marked in style, and then you have something that's stereotypically feminine to contrast it, and that would be something that's maybe softer, more lyrical. And sometimes composers will do this where they will have certain instruments represent those characters. So sometimes woodwinds, especially like upper woodwinds like flutes and clarinets, can be used to evoke a more feminine, sort of gentler character, if you will, and then brass are sometimes used for the quote-unquote masculine, more aggressive character. And I think that's interesting because for me, maybe the clarinet solo represents Caroline, and the solo cornet represents the man who's singing the song.
And for the people who are in band, the cornet is basically a type of trumpet that's slightly of a higher timbre. It sounds more bright than a regular trumpet.
So cornets and trumpets, that's an interesting thing. If we can kind of go on a tangent here really quick, Faolan. So cornets are a conical brass instrument, meaning that like euphonium and like the horn or the French horn, if you know it that way, in the tuba, where it has like a more mellow, kind of darker tone color. And what it means by conical, that refers to the bore or the size of the tubing through which you blow the air. And so conical instruments, the tubing gets progressively wider, or the bore gets wider as you go from the mouthpiece closer to the bell. Whereas a trumpet, like a trombone, is a cylindrical brass instrument, meaning that its bore is shaped like a cylinder, so the diameter of the tubing or the bore is almost exactly the same as you go from the mouthpiece all the way out to the bell until you get to the very end of the bell, and then it obviously spreads way out. Conical brass instruments tend to have a more mellow, darker sound, and trumpets tend to have a brighter, more strident sound. And in military band traditions, especially in the early 20th century, cornets, the darker, more mellow sound, would usually carry the melodic material, and the trumpets would usually, the brighter, more strident ones, would usually kind of accent what the percussion were doing and provide hits or highlights to certain elements of the music. And so you'll see that in a lot of older marches, that there may be a set of cornets and a set of trumpets, and that's what Vaughan Williams does here. He has a solo cornet, and then he has first cornet and second cornet, so you really need 3 cornet players, and then he has 2 trumpet parts, and that's pretty common for older marches in terms of instrumentation.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So let's go into the third folk song. It's also mentioned in this movement, Dives and Lazarus. So a very brief summary for it. It's originally from a biblical passage from Luke chapter 16. It's a parable from that. If you don't know what a parable is, basically it's like a story telling a lesson or a learned outcome. Mm-hmm. So the summary of the lyrics is Divarus, or Dives, he's rich. He has an elaborate house. He has servants, has a bunch of dogs. He throws this elaborate dinner, and he invites everyone to come to it, and everyone does. And Lazarus, who is poor, he shows up to the dinner and asks to take part, and Divarus refuses to let him in. So he persists. He's like, I want to be involved with your dinner. Divarus says no. Eventually, Divarus gets tired of him, and he sends his dogs and servants to basically move him and injure him so he doesn't come back. And it works. And eventually they both die, and Divarus is condemned to hell because of how he treated Lazarus. And then Lazarus goes to heaven, where he is offered unlimited food to eat. And one of the most notable adaptations of this piece is Vaughan Williams wrote 5 variants of Dives and Lazarus for orchestra. Basically, he slowed it down compared to how it was in the band version. It's a lot slower tempo, but you can still hear the theme and still kind of feel it, like, from Lazarus' perspective. Instead of it being like fanfaric and loud like it is in the March, it's more mellow and more melancholy compared to this in 5 variants, Dives and Lazarus, because it really is meant to tell like what Lazarus was facing when he was doing that, the uncertainty, the sadness. It's a great piece. Yeah.
And some of that uncertainty and sadness, or sort of the warring themes that are present in that story, are encapsulated here by Vaughan Williams via sort of warring parties in the orchestration. So you have the woodwinds playing this really aggressive, active 6/8 melody over top, really separated, and then this low voice and kind of the low reeds and saxophones and low brass, this beam, 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 beam. That's sort of representative of Divis's really harsh character, and then you have this pleading, insistent upper voice representative of Lazarus's character. So this is one of the most active, crunchy parts of the piece, and it's really effective that it's flanked on either side by Pretty Caroline, which is very lush and calm and pretty. So there's a lot of contrast and drama created when you go from that from Pretty Caroline into Dives and Lazarus and then back.
It really creates like the intensity of it. Then it goes into something more lyrical. This is an amazing piece, and the suite ends up finishing with the 17th Sunday relapse to the coda at the very end. Yeah. So let's go into the second movement, the Intermezzo, My Bonny Boy. So in case you don't know what the Intermezzo is, it's usually a very light lyrical composition. They're particularly found in multi-movement pieces. Like one of the most known intermezzos is, especially in the orchestral world, is from Georges Bizet's Carmen, which is between the second and third acts. kind of sounds like a nocturne. It's supposed to be more lyrical and more melancholy. It's just supposed to be something that leads you in, but it's not too dramatic. And it's more lyrical, more light, as I mentioned previously. In the band world, one of the most notable intermezzos is from the Holst First Suite. Mm-hmm. And despite it is of a faster tempo compared to most intermezzos usually are relatively slow. What's important is that lyrical aspect it brings into the piece, which is what's great. So let's talk more about this. So let's talk more about the form of the piece.
Yeah, so this is similar to some of the other movements in this piece, or the third movement in C songs. This is in ABA ternary form. So meaning we get an A section, we have a contrasting section in the middle, and then the original material returns in some form at the end. And this is the first A section that we get here is My Bonny Boy, is the folk song that we use. And there's sort of two strophes here. So strophic is just a version of theme and variations. It's pretty much any Christmas tune that Christmas carol that you've heard utilizes strophic form, where the music is the same, but the lyrics change. And the way that Vaughan Williams does that here is, since there's no lyrics in this wind ensemble piece, or military band piece to be more precise, he adds a little bit more density in terms of orchestration, so how many instruments are playing, and then he'll add some more colorful accompanimental figures around the melody the second time it comes back. And sorry, go ahead, Faolan. Yeah, you got something to add?
Yeah, one of those notable Christmas carols in strophic form is Greensleeves, because the Espé Wind Ensemble played that for the recent Kaleidoscope Holiday concert. It's an amazing piece, and no doubt a great example of strophic form.
Yep. And for those of you familiar with Percy Granger's Lincolnshire Posy, he uses strophic form in all 6 of the movements of that piece, which is also based on English folk song suite, or English folk songs. So we get the measure 1 as the first strophe of My Bonny Boy, and then the second strophe happens at measure 23. And then at measure 43, we get this tune called Green Bushes. So we go from being in sort of this slow 3 meter into feeling the tempo is poco allegro scherzando, so meaning more kind of like a playful dance. And we feel that 1 pulse per bar, and it's much more upbeat, but it still sort of has this melancholic feeling to it. And this is 2 strophes as well. So measure 43 is the first strophe, and measure 60 is the second strophe, and we get a lot more. We get this interesting sort of running eighth note or pseudo arpeggiation line that we get in in primarily the woodwinds that happens. We get some sustained stuff in the brass, so it becomes much more full. And then at measure 78, we get My Bonny Boy comes back again. And it's that serves as the second A section to round out the ternary form.
What is a strophe?
Oh, a strophe is just in strophic form. A strophe is one statement of the melody, is all that is. So, or you could just call it a statement. Would be a similar sort of thing.
Okay, so let's go into the folk songs themselves. There are two of them in this movement. The first one is My Bonny Boy. This is a love song. In the summary of the lyrics, it's about this girl. She deflects on a past during her teenage years. She was in love with a boy, and he was dating someone else at the moment. And eventually, after a lot of persistence, the boy eventually cheats on his girlfriend with her, and he realizes what he's done. He just gets up and moves away to another country in shame. And the girl was wondering, will she ever see him again, or was it her fault that he moved away? It's really just really uncertain what she's facing.
Yeah, and some of the ways that the complex emotions evoked by these lyrics are represented musically by Vaughan Williams is there's the kind of longing, remorse, and loss are represented by a Dorian mode. So Dorian is similar to just stock minor. It's a scale that we would build if we started on the major scale. If we played a major scale but started on scale degree 2 and went to scale degree 2, we do that. So it's a minor sounding kind of key, if you will. And then the tempo is pretty slow and it's very lyrical, so lots of connected sounds here. And there's some debate about whether at the beginning of this, at measure 3, because there's a solo cornet listed and a solo oboe, and there's some debate between people who will do this piece, if you should use one or both of those soloists, and if you used one, which one you should use. And I think you can make an argument anyway for just oboe, just cornet, or both. For me personally, I kind of like to do both, because if we go back to what we talked about in the first movement, where sort of the oboe being a woodwind color can represent sort of the feminine character, that can be the girl in the story, and the cornet can represent the masculine character, that can be her lover in the story. You kind of get both of those voices, both characters in the story represented musically in that way. Some other maybe really specific things that I think are cool here is there's this really pretty dynamic swell that will happen in measure 16. I think something that's often overlooked, that is worth taking a look at and highlighting. And then in measure 18, we get one of the few instances of major harmonies, of major triads being used in the chords that Vaughan Williams has underlying the melody. And for me, I think that maybe this is representing hope, because the lyrics in the original folk song here, it's the woman saying, "I built him a berth on my breast," which that's kind of Old English way. So to translate that into 21st century American English would be maybe, "I made a home for him in my heart." And so that, to me, is sort of her representing her love and sort of hopefulness that the relationship could work out.
Yeah, I kind of can see it means, she's acknowledging that he's gone. Hopefully he'll come back. And,
Yeah.
And the second folk song used in this is called Green Bushes. So the summary in the lyrics is, it's very similar to this one, the My Bonny Boy. So this man goes to meet a woman in the forest, or in the bushes. That's what they call it in the folk song. It's Old English. He's been together with her for some time. He was hoping to possibly marry her. And she asks him, and she's like, "No, I'm not marrying you. I'm dating someone else. I plan to marry him." And then he eventually realizes that love is not here in this part of the country for me. So he eventually packs up his things, and he leaves to another part of the country, hopefully more optimistic, and knowing, hey, there is someone out there for everyone. And that's true even now. And also one of the things that's really notable about this is Granger took Green Bushes and arranged it for wind ensemble as well.
Yeah, and it's cool to see some of these popular folk songs being set for wind ensemble by multiple different composers. And this, it's interesting that both of the tunes that Vaughan Williams chose for this particular movement have to deal with complex stories. This, to me, kind of mirrors Holst's use of I'll Love My Love in the second suite, which is a complex story if you go and you read into the lyrics about that, about a woman who has lost love and all that sort of stuff. I think some things here that Vaughan Williams does in Green Bushes that sort of help to encapsulate the story of this man who thought he had love and then it leaves him. As we alternate between a Dorian mode, like we had at the beginning of the movement, and then we go into Mixolydian, which is another mode. So if you take the major scale and build it off of scale degree 5, and you go from scale degree 5 to 5, instead of 1 to 1, you get sort of this jazzier, if you will, version of a major scale, but it's a more optimistic sounding key center than Dorian. It's also worth noting for anybody that's planning to do this piece with an ensemble that the transition into Green Bushes and the transition out of Green Bushes are particularly tricky, and especially for the conductor. There's a variety of ways that you can do this. Because you have this solo clarinet that leads you into Green Bushes from the previous tune. A lot of times conductors will choose to just stop here. Some people may add a sort of retardando to get into 43, into Green Bushes. I would advocate for probably letting the tempo stay the same, maybe a tiny little bit of stretching to go into Green Bushes, but just after the soloist plays and you release the sustains in 41, let the soloist do the work and then anticipate how they're going to land on the imagined downbeat of 43, and then welcome the rest of the group in. But I kind of like it if you can get it to where there's not a big gap in sound, but some people will choose to do that. And then in going into 78 can be a tricky little bit, so getting out of Green Bushes, because you have this 2-bar retardando, but you get a hemiola happening. So if the music, in other words, feels sort of like it's in 2/4 there instead of feeling like it's in 3. And you also have to go from conducting in 1, because most conductors will do this in 1, and then go back into 3 once you get to My Bonny Boy. So personally, I kind of like to 3 bars before we go back into My Bonny Boy, I try to sneak into 3 and then use that to help slow the ensemble down by just allowing the pattern to get bigger as it slows down. And then 78, you come back into the original tempo, or the tempo primo as it's marked, to get you back into the original first folk song.
All right, let's go on to movement 3. So, all right, Dr. Kaatz, this one's all you.
Yeah. So this folk song is also set in ABA ternary. It uses da capo march form, if we want to call it that. And unlike movement 1, where movement 1 is very, okay, here's the statement of this folk song, here's the statement of this folk song, Vaughan Williams is a little bit more complex in the way that he arranges the sections here. So our first A section actually contains 3 folk songs. In measure 1, we get Blow Away the Morning Dew, which serves as an A section, like a local level A section. And then we get measure 29 is this tune called High Germany, which serves as sort of a B section. And then in measure 45, we get another statement of Blow Away the Morning Dew. So within the A section, which starts at measure 1 and ends at the quote-unquote trio at measure 71, we have this thing called a nested form. So we have kind of this miniature ternary form inside of the A section of the movement level ternary form. So that's kind of a neat thing that he does here. So then we get to measure 71, and we go into the B section, which is labeled the trio of the march. And we have 2 folk songs here. So we get sort of a local level binary form, a form meaning that we have 2 sections, so 2 parts of this section of the piece. So at measure 71, we get the tree so high, and then at measure 89, we get the B section of the B section, if you will, a tune called John Barleycorn. So then after that, we get a da capo fine, like we had in the first movement, and that repetition of all of the A section material creates for us an ABA ternary. Because all of that, the Blow Away the Morning Dew and High Germany and Blow Away the Morning Dew get repeated again. So if you look at it with that repeat factored in, you have A, B, A, and we get our ABA ternary right there. So if we dive in to a little bit of the folk songs here, our first tune is Blow Away the Morning Dew. This is the lyrics tell the story of a farmer's son who goes out hunting early in the morning and meets a rich girl at the river. They go to her father's house and she gives him some money, but they don't end up staying together. So this is kind of, so again, another story with sort of conflicting themes, and we get this because there's this constant oscillation between, like the first movement, staccato characters, or staccato sort of setting, and then we get some lyrical stuff, and within even just a couple of bars, we can get these switches between the 2 things. And it's also interesting, we have a lot of back and forth between the woodwinds will play a part, and then the brass will play a part, and the woodwinds play a part. And to me, this is sort of like the girl being the woodwinds talking with her father, and the boy in the story, which are represented by the brass characters. And again, here we get some kind of subito dynamic changes that I think are really worth trying to bring out.
Yeah, the name of the movement itself is called Folk Songs from Somerset, which is from the Somerset region of England. Holst actually wrote a Somerset Rhapsody for orchestra, which featured music from the same region. It's from northern England, and as a result of that, Vaughan Williams really took inspiration from Holst's Somerset Rhapsody. Somerset Rhapsody was his first most successful composition. And Vaughan Williams decided to write folk song in the same region. The second one is High Germany. Some of the lyrics from that is a man bids farewell to his beloved before he goes off World War I. He asks her to come along with him, but she says she can't. She stays at home.
Yeah, and so it's, again, another folk song with some really conflicting lyrics here that's pretty... it's sort of a sad story, a melancholic story. That seems to be a big recurring theme for the English, especially in these sorts of things, in these stories. And so you get a little bit of this man goes off to fight for the war in the war against Germany, and we get a little bit more martial character here because we get some snapped rhythms, some da-ka-da-ka-da 16th note things, and we get these more aggressive gestures, which are kind of evocative of the conflict that the man is about to enter into.
And the third folk song is called The Tree So High. It's a conversation between her daughter and her mother about the daughter's desire to become married and be with her husband.
Yeah, and so these lyrics, if you go and look them up and kind of filter through the Old English to get them to be in kind of standard American English, these lyrics are a little spicy, and so they're not particularly G-rated. So it's sort of interesting to read about that and read those lyrics. So we're going to leave those off, but you can go and look at those at your own time. But that's, I think, why there's sort of more of this angsty character with this, is that the daughter has this desire to go and be married and all of the things that come with that, and the mother is like, well, you're looking too ahead of yourself and you're being overly dramatic, and that's why you have sort of the brass doing this da da da, this sort of aggressive staccato underneath sort of this legato woodwind music, which I think is representative of the girl's feelings of love, and the brass are sort of encapsulating the mother's agitation with her daughter via their kind of like sharp articulate chords.
And the third folk song, just to be brief, it's called John Barleycorn. It's a really short folk song. This overall summary of it is 3 men coming from the north, saying, hey, I'm looking for someone named John Barleycorn. Like, when you find him, he must die.
Yeah, and so these are kind of bounty hunters, if you will, looking for this guy who's supposedly done a crime or something. And this is a fairly aggressive folk song. There's a brass dominant, and it's loud, dynamic, and you get a lot of these sort of fanfare figures, da-ka-dum-dum-dee-da. And so this, I think, encapsulates sort of the conflict of John Barleycorn being hunted by these bounty hunters, so to speak. And then Vaughan Williams here, he plays the tree so high in John Barleycorn, and then that whole section gets repeated again. And this is mostly set in minor. C minor is the prevailing key here. And then we go back after completing that to Blow Away the Morning Dew, this sort of sweet, lovely tune at the beginning to start the second iteration of the A section.
That's the main suite. So let's go into the unofficial fourth movement called Sea Songs, which I haven't had the score for right here, and I know you do as well, Dr. Kaatz. So it was written in the same year as the suite, but Vaughan Williams tended to use it as the second movement of it originally, but he decided not to. He originally posed it. Usually it's played fourth. Now, some recordings play it second, but usually it is played with the main suite. Usually it's played last, after the main suite's played. So Toccata Marziale was also composed the exact same year. So it was really notable wind band pieces, 3 notable wind band pieces composed in the exact same year by the same composer.
And so this piece is another iteration of da capo march form, so very similar to the third movement of the English folk song suite. We have a sort of nested form here again, but this would be an ABC ternary in our A section. So our A section is composed of 3 folk songs. We have Princess Royal, which starts at measure 1, that I call the first strain. It's also worth noting that most of the movements, like all of the movements, I believe, in the English folk song suite start with sort of this little intro bar of about 2 to 4 measures that kind of will play some sort of snippet of the theme of the first folk song. So that's all of these tend to have an intro. And so after a very brief intro here, we get this song called Princess Royal. And then that sort of serves as your first strain, if you will. At measure 33, we get this tune called Admiral Benbow, which is played twice, and that serves as our kind of second strain. And then measure 49, we get Princess Royal again, which you could call another A strain, or because it's a little bit abbreviated here, I kind of refer to that as a codetta strain, but we still get this nested ABA ternary inside of the A section of our full movement level ternary form. Then at B, we get a new folk song called Portsmouth. That's played twice, and that serves as our central contrasting section. And after that is done, we get a da capo al fine, like we had in previous movements of the English folk song suite, and so that repeats all of the A section material, Princess Royal, Admiral Benbow, and then that abbreviated version of Princess Royal. Again, it repeats all of that material. So looking at that zoomed out, we get an ABA ternary form.
And it ends at the measure before Portsmouth begins, which is the trio of the march. So let's go into the folk songs themselves. So Princess Royal. It begins the introduction of the dun 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 dun. Then the actual theme starts coming in. The summary of the lyrics is, I couldn't find lyrics to this piece, and it wasn't mostly the reason why I couldn't find them is because there isn't any. It's actually a dance. When I listen to the piece, I kind of can hear how it sounds like a dance in its own way, and it's attributed to Irish harpist, who's also composer Raleigh or Carolan, who is the Baroque era, lived in the early part of the Baroque era, and collector Edward Bunting in the Ancient Music of Ireland, which composed in 1840.
Yeah, and so what's interesting about this tune is, in the research that I've done, it's not clear if there were originally lyrics to this, but people have set lyrics to this tune, but I think it was mostly used for dancing, like a fiddle tune that people would dance to. But this definitely does sound like a dance in the way that Vaughan Williams has set it. You have this sort of dum-dum-dum-dum-dum, these staccato eighth notes sort of running ostinato in the lower voices, and these playful kind of upper woodwind lines that are carrying the melody and these sorts of things. And this is another example of Vaughan Williams using contrasting dynamics to encapsulate character and create drama, because we start with this big fortissimo kind of brass fanfare statement with some upper woodwinds in the mix, and then as soon as the theme gets introduced, the dynamic drops down suddenly to piano, and it's very light and very calm and sort of pretty, with a lot of slur markings over the fast notes. And then at rehearsal letter B, we get another statement of the melody, but the brass join in now, and it's at fortissimo, which is sort of, maybe it was one or two people dancing before, and now kind of the whole town has jumped in to join the dance. And
at the reprise of the dance at a letter E after Admiral Benbow, there's only three instruments doing the melody. It's the alto saxophone, the alto clarinet, and the euphonium. One thing I've noticed looking at the score is the euphonium part is a dynamic higher compared to the other two. So once the euphonium part is more pronounced compared to the other parts of it. As a euphoniumist myself, as a solo, I know how to play.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So let's jump over to Admiral Benbow, the B section.
Yeah, it occurs right before this. So the story about it is, it's about this. It's a sailor song. It's about an Admiral Benbow fighting and sea, and he's in a battle where he lost his legs. Believe it or not, it's actually based off a true story of Admiral John Benbow. He's an admiral in the British Navy who, in the 1700s, he fought pirates, especially Captain Kidd, who was a really notorious pirate during the pirate age of the early 1700s.
Yes, and when I did this piece a few years ago with the symphonic band at Stephen F. Austin State University, I actually found videos of people singing this. There was like a group of... It was an a cappella group of guys in England, older gentlemen, and they were doing it in a bar, and it was a lot of fun to kind of see them singing it. This song is also featured as one of the sea shanties that you can get in Assassin's Creed 4 on your ship, and I'm a big fan of that franchise, and so when I made that connection, I was like, I swear, when I was studying this piece, I was like, I swear I have heard this song before, and I found it's on the Assassin's Creed soundtrack, so which is set in the pirate age, and so it's a perfect tie-in, which is really cool.
And the even cooler part of Assassin's Creed is Captain Kidd's actually in there, and I'm a huge AC4 fan. That's one of the games I really got into and started playing Assassin's Creed 4. So you want to play Assassin's Creed 4, a little connection to Windband music.
Yeah, see, we're learning about history while we're playing video games. But some of the minor mode that Vaughan Williams uses here reflects sort of the grim nature of the battle, or maybe even the cold spray of the sea, because this is definitely a sea shanty. And you get these seemingly random 2D fortissimo interjections where they bum, bum, bum. And to me, that's sort of the response of the sailors on the boat listening to the guy telling the story, being in the bar and hearing the story of Admiral Benbow. Somebody's getting up and telling the story, and then everybody else is like, ah, ha, ha, agreeing with or commenting on the story as it's being told in the bar.
I also noticed the key actually changed for Admiral Benbow. It's not an F minor anymore, it's an E flat. Mm-hmm. So E flat is kind of like a more relatively brighter key compared to F minor.
Yeah.
So let's go into the trio, Portsmouth. So there's a key change for that into a D flat, which is more of a darker key. Probably one of my favorite keys for wind band because of how dark it can sound.
Yeah, it's a very noble sounding key, I think. And here we go from, because we were in C minor briefly for Admiral Benbow, and then we go back to A flat major, I believe, for Princess Royal. We're in A flat major for Princess Royal, and then like we would do in American March, we go up to, we go up a fourth, and we're in the trio, so we add a flat. We're now in this noble key of D. D flat. And Portsmouth is a country dance tune with lyrics about a woman saying goodbye to her beloved as he goes to war to fight. She's lamenting whether or not he will return or not. And so this has another kind of melancholic theme of potential heartbreak. But we're in a major mode, and there's a lot of legato stylistic markings here, which I think help to emulate or help to encapsulate sort of the idea of this woman's love for the person that she's hoping for will return. And I've listened to settings of this tune by folk groups, and it tends to be a lot faster. So it's interesting that Vaughan Williams sort of takes it here and stretches it out, and tends, I think, in the way that he sets the music, tends to focus on sort of the love that the woman has and not necessarily her fear of loss and loneliness with the man being gone at sea.
And the most notable thing, this is the famous Portsmouth melody, da 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 da. That melody is primarily presented in the low instruments or the clarinets playing in a very low register, which really allows that tension and that what she could be facing, just to represent her how she feels emotionally.
Yeah, and you get kind of in the bottom part of the chalumeau register of the clarinet, this kind of dark, rich, chocolatey sound, I think, mixed with the horns playing it. So it's a lot of really mellow sounds. So it's really, really pretty setting.
And eventually the flutes get brought in. They play the Portsmouth theme as well, so it kind of adds a little bit of hope in what she could be feeling.
Yeah, a little bit of sparkle, if you will. Yeah.
And then Portsmouth eventually ends, and repeats the second time. Then eventually it ends, and it plays the Princess Royal and the Alabimbo up, and then does the reprise Princess Royal. It ends on the chord right before Portsmouth.
Yeah, and so I think it's interesting as sea songs. Sea songs you can absolutely do with the English folk song suite as the second movement. I've been around groups that have done that, but you can also do it as a standalone piece. But I don't think it works well as sort of an end piece of a concert because you end in minor with Admiral Benbow. It seems like the tension is not really resolved, whereas the final movement of the English folk song suite tends to be a little bit more satisfying as like a conclusion.
Yeah, and sometimes sea songs is played separately. It is on the PML. It's a grade 4 on there. Mm-hmm. High schools usually play it as their march for the year. I know high school did back in my old school district as their march during the pandemic.
I think it's a great opener for a concert. I think it fits that position really well on a program.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the legacy of these pieces. How this affects future pieces and tie in with the whole suites. Now, as you mentioned with the whole suites, Holst based some of the folk songs. Vaughan Williams based some of this from the same folk song collector as Gustav Holst, because Cecil Sharp also supplied the folk songs Holst used during his second suite. And so it was really important that these both of them use the same exact collector to collaborate these two folk songs. And another big collection also was the style of the march, because all three marches are written in the capo ABA march form. Because in the second suite, the march, there are three folk songs in that. The A section is a Morris dance called Glorious Years. The B section is a Swansea Town, and then it goes into the trio, which is the 6/8 Claudy Banks sea shanty. Mm-hmm. That eventually ends with everything up to the Claudy Banks trio. But we'll talk about that piece in a future episode. But it's still a great example of how these two major pieces influenced each other. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think this will become more evident for us when we go and explore the second suite. But I am convinced that Vaughan Williams had some sort of contact with Holst, and especially his second suite, before he wrote this piece, because there's so many parallels between things that he does in this piece that Holst also did in his second suite in F. And there's several other arrangements of these tunes. I think by a major English composer at the beginning of the 20th century writing this for band inspired future generations of people to write other things. I mean, Vaughan Williams was a big fan of Dives and Lazarus. He, as you said earlier, he had set that for string orchestra. Samuel Hazo's written a piece that's a Fantasia on 17 Come Sunday. And then Gordon Jacob, a student of Ralph Vaughan Williams, set this whole piece for the whole English folk song suite for orchestra later in his life. And then there's also a string orchestra arrangement of the piece by Stephen Bulla. So I didn't know that. I think you had found that. That's good.
Yeah, it's a great piece. I actually found it in my old high school orchestra library one time. I was like, oh yeah, I love the English folk song suite. And for anyone wondering, the Samuel Hazo piece, if you guys want to check it out, it's called For Heaven in the Future. Amazing, beautiful piece. Great Fantasia.
Yeah.
And let's talk more about the legacy of this piece in the wind band. Like, eventually it became one of the quote-unquote core pieces of the wind band rep, which is like, there's a lot of pieces that are in there. So what exactly is a core piece?
So a core repertoire piece would be something that we would say is, so the repertoire, meaning all the pieces that have been written for our medium, so for the wind band. A core repertoire piece would be something that's central, like a piece that a lot of people would identify as like, yes, that's a really good piece that we should know, that all like bands should play. And this piece is, I think, asserted itself as one of those. I would definitely place this in our core repertoire. Part of that is because it's one of the earliest examples we have of a piece originally written for band, so not written for another medium and then transcribed or arranged for band, but written originally for band by a major composer of the Western art music canon that is of a serious nature. And so, because there's, we've had composers that have written sort of fun pieces for us that are kind of light and fluffy, but this, like the Holst suites, are some of the first examples we have of really seriously crafted pieces specifically for band to be played kind of for art's sake. And I think the folk song use in this piece, like we've talked about in our Holst podcast, I think by Vaughan Williams and Holst using folk songs in this piece as sort of a central element of the compositional process, that trend has continued in the wind band world, where there's a lot of notable pieces in the wind band repertoire that use folk songs as the generative material. So you can look at Lincolnshire Posy by Percy Granger is a great example. Variations on a Korean Folk Song by John Barnes Chance is another really popular piece that uses this. And I would even argue that we have a lot of pieces that have started to use jazz and popular music, and those are sort of modern-day folk songs, if you will.
Like one of the most notable ones I think you're very familiar with is Beaton Bender's Melodious Thunk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He uses Salt Peanuts by Melodious Thunk, or Melodious Thunk's version of that. The jazz standard Salt Peanuts is prevalent throughout a lot of that piece. Stephen Bryant has used Radiohead tunes as part of his generative material in his Concerto for Wind Ensemble. There's a lot of instances of popular music or music of the people, which is essentially what folk songs are. Like folk songs were what we had before we had radios, really. So a lot of that being woven into the texture of other pieces, that's a pretty common thing that happens.
Yeah, and thinking about that, it kind of reminds you a lot of the From the Delta we played earlier this semester. Despite it's not written by folk material, it's based on that sort of material.
Yep, yeah, absolutely. William Grant Still's From the Delta, his first piece for band, was inspired by African-American folk songs. So, yeah, and I think this piece I would estimate this piece will probably be played as long as concert bands exist on this planet, and because it's been popular for so long, and I think it's a good piece, and I think it's popular, and for good reason. I think it's going to be played for a long time, and that's part of the reason why I would say it's definitely part of our core repertoire.
It's no doubt an amazing piece, and it's a great piece, and one of the first time listening to band music, this is one of the first pieces I got into. So if you're trying to get into music and need something to listen to, check this piece out. It's great.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, this has been Faolan Smith and Dr. Kaatz for our second episode of the podcast series. Please stay tuned for future episodes. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks a lot.